Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Forgotten Humanity, written by Dark Prince 010. The human homeworld, a ball of rock and water and mud deemed unimaginatively Earth, had been surprisingly difficult to find. Humans had spread across their entire arm of the Milky Way, a persistent and annoyingly resilient species that had refused to come under the thumb of any of the warlords and grand conquerors that had spread across the galaxy. Occasionally fighting to a standstill, mostly it was just a problem trying to corner humans before they could activate their jump drives, a technology they managed to miniaturize and streamline like few others had done before them. It meant that any of their fleets could be light years away in a moment, well and truly gone by the time their pursuers managed to warm up their own core and follow suit. So, when Ritar the Magnificent began her campaign of conformity and unity, she had designated an entire task force of her armada to simply cornering and quelling the humans, seeking to bring them under her rule peaceably, if possible, but completely, regardless of the cost. So the task force had ventured forth, but upon reaching the outskirts of human colonies, they found nothing there. No signs of damage or destruction. In fact, everything seemed to be in good repair. Fields still had crops, larders were still stocked, factories were still running, although most of those were automated to the point of only having a few living supervisors at any given time anyways. But no humans. Even the animals the humans kept as companions, a thought that made most right-thinking species in the galaxy shudder with revulsion, seemed calm. In previous experiments, it had been found that these creatures, especially the ones known as dogs, could become agitated or even violent when separated from their humans for a prolonged period of time. But the ones the exploratory teams found running among the abandoned colonies and empty cities were happy. Cautious of outsiders and intruders, of course, and some injuries were sustained as a result, but lacking the basal fear response they had seen when separated from their prime companions. But still, no matter where they looked, no matter how many rocks they overturned, no sign of humanity remained. No real progress was made until they reached Earth itself. An unarmed transport barge with a few dozen researchers on board landing on the planet's surface. There, the story was much the same as the rest of the galaxy. Clear signs that it had seemed like humanity had been there just mere minutes before, but had since vanished. Not a trace to be found. A sense of the pervasive unease began to spread amongst the researchers. It grew as clues continued to be scarce as to what had truly happened to humanity, until one of the more experimentally minded sociologists in the group began to run surveys amongst the researchers. At first written off as a waste of time, some disturbing patterns began to emerge. The test was simple, providing a small nutritional supplement additive as a treat before depriving the research subject of it shortly afterwards and gauging their responses based on not just getting what they had expected. As anticipated, the reactions were a normal range of frustration, discontent, and anger, but also included in those questions was a question of how they felt not having found humanity. And while disappointment was of course present, despite this being the sole goal of the expeditionary force, the frustrations were almost negligible compared to the disappointment and anger felt by the test subjects on simply losing out on a small snack. This caught the attention of the leads of the research force, and another round of tests was ordered, finding consistently similar results. But before further follow-up studies could be performed, tragedy struck as the researcher leading the surveys tumbled from the edge of a tall building, falling to the death on the mossy concrete below. After an appropriate period of mourning, the research pressed on, the curious surveys falling out of interest as renewed work began looking for some sign of where humanity might have left to. While there were great shipyards for spacefaring craft, nothing was the size and scope that would be needed to evacuate a single planet, let alone all of humanity's off-world holdings and stations. Still, some clues were found. There were researchers that said that they had found written documents mentioning something about a Project Oblia, but when they went to take further notes, the writings had disappeared. Ritar had become impatient with their lack of progress, for humanity was the only major faction not under her control in this entire sector of the galaxy. and her armies on the distant frontiers were making significant headways into other empires that ruled across the cosmos. The military commander, who was sent to oversee the project and hasten their work, was found dead in his office. Clear signs of foul play, as he had been strangled with the very whip that he once hung at his belt. This infuriated Rata the Magnificent, for her rule was one of the unquestioning devotion and harsh penalties for disloyalty. She showed some degree of mercy by sending merely a squad of enforcers to torture those they deemed responsible for the assassination, while allowing the rest to go on with their work. But within hours of them setting foot on Earth, the enforcers too met their unfortunate fates, falling off high ledges even where safety ratings had been established, weapons malfunctions that resulted in clean shots through craniums and spinal columns, and the replacement commander likewise becoming entangled in his own whip. He was alive, but humiliated, as he had to ask help from his lessers in freeing and untangling him. Security tape and footage were evaluated for any signs of foul play, but nothing untoward was noticed. Simply poor luck and happenstance leading to the deaths of over a dozen elite soldiers. It was under these bleak circumstances, as further troops were sent to reinforce the infuriated commander, that one of the junior researchers noticed what they had at first described to an anomalous item. It was a small multicolored ball, a child's toy to any species, but one that for some reason seemed omnipresent. At first it was assumed that it was simply a mass-produced item, one of the thousands or millions of such toys meant to entertain small and young minds, but others reported never seeing two of them at the same time. It was only one ball, but one that seemed to show up in lockers and on tables, and even occasionally in pockets of the uniforms, as if it had fallen from an otherwise empty shelf overhead. Curiosity mounted until the toy was brought to the attention of the commander, who dismissed it with a snarl, throwing the offending item at great distance. When the researcher went to recover the artifact, they found that it had impacted a wall at great speed, cracking open along a purposeful seam in the plastic structure. Within was a small foil-covered human delicacy, a food referred to as chocolate, made from a dried and refined bean paste and sweetened with glucose additive. While technically edible, it wasn't an especially desirable food stuff for the researchers. But what they found was curious was that when they snapped the pieces of the ball back together, idly popping it apart a few hours later resulted in an appearance of more of the foil-wrapped food. This seemed to repeat itself, as whenever the ball was left unattended on an open surface, almost every time it could be opened to uncover more edible items. What was within also changed, at first being a foil-wrapped chocolates, then replaced by a small handful of disc-like waxed glucose-coated chocolates, also in a bright array of colors. Although it seemed the more frequently the ball was opened, the fewer of these chocolate discs were included. Finally, after some study of human delicacies and writing structures, the junior researcher scribed a note on a small slip of paper and enclosed it within the empty orb. This time, the orb disappeared and did not reappear for some weeks. It had almost faded out of memory. The researchers back to studying over abandoned cities, as keen-eyed and paranoid soldiers watched, with weapons raised on hair triggers in the event the researchers were responsible for the deaths and incidents earlier. While poring through one of these human libraries as the dawn broke, the researcher noticed a weight in their pocket once more, and pulled out the ball once again. Confused but delighted, they popped it open to reveal another curiosity. This was a piece of paper, different from the one they put in. But while the paper was legible enough, the researcher was struck by the odd and empty ball. Picking it up to close it as they wondered how it had gotten on the floor, the researcher felt a shiver pass over their short fur. Looking back, they saw that there was a piece of paper on the ground, some sort of discarded human writing, something they must not have noticed when they first stepped into the room. The writing on it was clear, but felt fuzzy to the researcher's mind, despite the ink being stark and plain on the paper. Looking up to find a book, the researcher couldn't recall what book they were looking for, or whether they were looking for a book in the first place. After all, they were in a library, not even one of their own culture, so it would be odd for them to be seeking a specific alien book out. Still, the structure did offer a welcome relief from the hot noon sun overhead, so they were glad not to have been working in one of the outside evacuation zones. They then glanced down and started, realizing that they were holding a piece of paper in their hand when they didn't even realize picking it up. Its writing was blurry, indistinct, and hard to make out, even though the letters were unblemished, and the researcher began to feel a headache overtake them, their mouth dry if they had not eaten or drank in some hours. Smacking their tongue against their parched mouth, they looked up to the library, feeling like they were looking at something within the library but not sure what, presumably a book, for that was almost all the library contained. But they couldn't recall why until they felt an odd sensation in their hand. Looking down, they blinked in confusion, for there was a piece of paper fluttering in the slight wind from the open window, a sound they could only now hear, even though they felt a breeze on them from some minutes before. The researcher feeling exhaustion on the edge of their senses as they looked up to realize that they had stood in the same position since almost nightfall. On some instinct kept the paper in front of them as they glanced from side to side, not moving their head so as to keep the paper within their field of vision. They remembered that they wanted to find a way to translate the odd and indistinct writings clearly written on the page, and found their notebook alongside a number of human encyclopedias and dictionaries. Slowly, but painstakingly keeping the paper before them the whole time, they managed to reach their translation section. Not all of the words were able to be translated, but those that the researcher could find equivalents for resulted in a message that said, "You have come to the end of your search. We wish to be left alone, but we also do not want to abandon those in need. Do you need help?" The researcher stared at the message, stunned, and then glanced up. The sun had set hours ago, the moon far overhead. They could feel the tightness in their throat as they caught sight of a glimpse of a scrap of paper fluttering on the ground. Their throat was raw as if they'd been screaming, but they couldn't recall saying a word. Then the researcher saw them, an adult and child, the human standing before them, and seemed to slide and shift within the vision without ever moving. The child was holding a ball that seemed to be everywhere all at once, and gave the researcher an expression referred to by humans as a smile. Before the adult nodded, then the child tossed the researcher the ball. As the researcher looked down and caught it, they looked up, confused why the ball had fallen into their hand, and unsure why the sudden flood of emotions through their mind was causing them to feel every kind of frustration and excited joy all at once. In the weeks to come, Ritar the Magnificent was soon known as Ritar the Unfortunate. Some even whispered that she should be better known as Ritar the Cursed, as her empire crumbled through the worst combination of circumstances and incidental accidents. Shipyards were destroyed as their reactor cores were accidentally blocked by mere space debris. Countless politicians and military leaders perished, some by their own hand, others by falls, equipment malfunctions, and, on one notable occasion, an explosive decompression of an entire political delegation thanks to an unfortunate micrometeorite burrowing a hole through the side of a shuttle. In all, it was scarcely 2 years later before Ritar the Unfortunate's reign ended, the Queen herself having leapt in despair from her balcony, although some onlookers claimed that her actions as she did so were strangely stiff. Still, with her demise the empire crumbled, replaced by nation-states and minor leaders, each trying to carve out some measure of stability from the loss of the dictatorship. And for one researcher in particular, they kept until the end of their days a small toy, a colorful plastic ball on the mantle, the memento of the days before humanity was forgotten. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.